Thank you, Makiba, for that introduction, and thank you, all of you, for being with us here today. It's wonderful to see so many of the ACLU's leadership supporters together, and it is, I think, one of the very few silver linings of this pandemic is that we're able to be here together in this space virtually in a way that we probably would not be if we were trying to gather in person. So I'm very grateful to get to share this time with you. As Makiba said, I'm the current director of the ACLU Women's Rights Project. And I say current because, of course, when we've heard about the ACLU Women's Rights Project in the last week or so, it has mostly been in connection with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, whom we lost just last Friday. The loss of Justice Ginsburg is something that we at the ACLU feel very deeply and personally. And unfortunately, it's just one of many events in the past couple of weeks that have made this, I think, quite a roller coaster emotionally and politically, certainly for us, and I'm sure for all of you as well. And that's part of why we wanted to take this moment, come together to create a forum for us to share with you directly, for you to share back with us directly. As Makiba said, we are going to do a two-part session. So we will we'll begin together for half an hour, and then we'll go into breakout rooms. It's something of a new format for us, so please bear with us as we learn this structure. We are, of course, none of us new to Zoom, but we are still trying to find ways to make Zoom new and exciting for you and for us. So just bear with us. So the first half an hour, I'm together with some of my colleagues. We'll share reflections on Justice Ginsburg, the impact of the loss of her life and her seat on the Supreme Court for the future of civil rights and civil liberties. And of course, we also want to talk about the election, which I'm sure is top of mind for many of you after last night. We are now 34 days away. I feel like it's already, we're so close, and also it's only 34 days at the same time. Those things both feel true at this moment. So we'll share with you the work that we have been doing and that we are currently doing to expand access to the ballot in this very intense lead up to ensure that everyone can vote safely during the pandemic, and to mobilize voters in key states to turn out and to vote with civil liberties at top of mind. So we'll spend about half an hour in that conversation, and then at 3:30 Eastern, which is the time zone that I'm in, and I wonder where many of you are, we'll move into smaller breakout sessions with help from Makiba, and there we'll have sort of just smaller group chats where you'll be able to speak with me and some of my colleagues. We are, very interested to hear what's top of mind for you at this moment, and to be able to share kind of what's top of mind for us. So before we dive into this first 30-minute session, I just want to introduce my colleagues. Joining me first is Ronald Newman. He's the director of our National Political Advocacy Department. He's going to share more about our response to the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett, as well as our voter education and mobilization work. Ronnie, I don't know if you want to wave or say hello so you bump up to a highlighted spot on the grid.
Hey guys, good to see everybody on Zoom.
And thanks, Ronnie. And then I'm also joined by Sophia Lin Lakin. She's Deputy Director of our Voting Rights Project. And she's going to share more about her impressively growing docket of lawsuits filed in just the last 6 months to protect voters during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and for all your support.
So I wanted to start really just by taking a moment to honor the loss of Justice Ginsburg. People have asked me many times in the last week and a half, how it feels to hold a position that she once held. And I have to say it's quite intimidating. And none of us can live up to the meme that is the notorious RBG. And we picture her, sitting on the bench in the Supreme Court, as tiny as she was in stature, as enormous as she was in impact and mind. Sometimes I picture her with a little crown that we've all seen on sort of tote bags and on Tumblr. But before RBG was a meme, she was the first director and founder of the ACLU Women's Rights Project in 1972. And in 1972, there were no tote bags with RBG on it. There was just RBG herself. She was 39 years old. And she set out to do something really different, to create the Women's Rights Project, not just as a standalone organization, as some sort of feminists were beginning to do, but really to situate the Women's Rights Project within the ACLU. And she did that because she believed that gender justice is an issue that affects not only women, it affects all of us. She felt very keenly the ways in which stereotypes and rules about the proper roles of men and women and the family and beyond were limiting and stifling not only for women, but also for men who were not able to fully, share both in the load and in the joy, of being a parent, of being a caregiver, and of having a really rich life both inside the home and outside of the home. And she also felt like we weren't never going to get there in gender justice if it was just a women's issue. We needed to see women's rights as a civil rights issue, and that's why she brought the Women's Rights Project to the ACLU. And I think all of the reasons that Justice Ginsburg chose to found WRP within the ACLU are exactly what makes us so strong today. We are not just the Women's Rights Project. We are not just the Voting Rights Project. We are all part of one ACLU, and we're able to lean on each other and to learn from each other and to look at all of our issues, not just as one issue, but as a part of the civic core that we're trying to build. So I know where I was on Friday night, that Friday night when I learned that Justice Ginsburg had passed. And I wanted to ask Sophia to join me and share, just her initial reaction as a voting rights litigator. What does the loss of Justice Ginsburg mean to you?
Well, my initial reaction is probably not something that I can say here. But, we were in the midst of we had just closed out oral argument in a trial, one of 4 that we had this month, and working deep into the night on some documents that we had to file. And I got a text from one of the other lawyers that I was working with and said, "Oh my God, RBG." And I kind of knew in the pit of my stomach what she was probably saying, but I hadn't seen any other news alerts or flashes come through yet. So I was hoping that I was wrong, but I wasn't. And it was, I think, similar to everyone else at the ACLU, probably shocking, and on some level not shocking, but shocking, and a little demoralizing in the moment, at least initially, just given everything that we've been kind of working towards and struggling with over the, I would say, past decade, but certainly the last 4 years, especially. And kind of coming together. This was a moment when I thought, oh, it really, really is very too bad that we are not physically in the same space. And I felt it would have been a very nice moment for us to come together as an organization, even as a Voting Rights Project group, in order to process this news in a way that we could kind of use to move forward more positively. I think we all came to that point generally, but it was certainly challenging in the moment. In terms of voting rights specifically, unfortunately, I would say that while Justice Ginsburg was such a powerful voice for voting rights, and civil rights generally, but in voting rights in particular, it was frequently a voice in the dissent. There have been, unfortunately, very few wins in the voting rights sphere for quite some time at the Supreme Court. A handful, but very few. And for those handful of wins, I think, unfortunately, the balance is obviously very different in our minds right now. And I think the one case where, I think is on a lot of people's minds is the current census case that we have. We had a prior census case in which we challenged the inclusion of a citizenship question on the census because of the depressing effect that would have on response rates from minority communities, immigrant communities, and so forth. And that would have extreme effects on not just representation of certain communities in our government, but in terms of resources available for schools, for hospitals, you name it, roads. We were able to prevail at the Supreme Court. Dale Ho, the director of the Voting Rights Project, argued, and we prevailed with Justice Roberts as the 5th vote. Unfortunately, the Trump administration just recently decided that it still wanted to use the census to weaponize its sort of racially targeted project of exclusion to keep undocumented immigrants off from the census count. We brought suit again this summer and prevailed so far, but we are on an expedited track to the Supreme Court. And it's obviously a different place right now, and that is, well, I think the question is cleaner and that we should obviously prevail, there's always a little bit of that concern. So hard to process, but one of the good things I would say with respect to at least voting rights, good or bad, as depending on how you see it is such a state by state issue. As you may or may not know, the rules of voting are very different in different places and different states, and states can, for the most part, they have a lot of room to decide how you vote, where you vote, how many days you get to vote, and these types of things. And so many of the gains that we have seen in recent times has been through state by state litigation and advocacy work to really expand their right. And that's certainly what we've been doing right now during COVID. And I imagine a strategy that we will pursue much more aggressively going forward.
Thanks, Sophia. Hard to imagine the Supreme Court in the census question that it feels like just yesterday that we were celebrating our win. And of course, as we've seen from the Trump administration, no ruling is sacrosanct to them. I'd like to pivot to Ronnie and just talk a little bit about the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett and the upcoming confirmation hearing. And I think watching the nomination feel though the timeline that has been proposed is the fastest we've ever seen. It's no more than twice as fast as I think it was used in the previous nomination. At the same time, the confirmation can feel a bit inevitable. So what role is there for us at the ACLU to play, and how are we organizing in response to this nomination?
Thank you, Ria. So I want to do three quick things. One, like Ria noted and Sophia echoed, the political department at the ACLU has also been reeling a bit since the loss of RBG, but also working to figure out the implications for the work we do. Her loss is obviously tragic from a civil liberties perspective, given the impact on the court's jurisprudence, but it also has real implications for the work we do moving forward. So as we work on the election, which is top of mind and top of portfolio for everybody in the department, we are also looking ahead to next year and things we might do in Congress. And so one of the pieces is you recognize that you might have a court that's more hostile to our civil liberties positions, opining on legislation that makes it through Congress. And so you need to factor that in to how you try to scope and calibrate policy that we might move on Capitol Hill. It also focuses the mind quite a bit on the work we do politically at the state level. And so, for instance, we are engaged in ACLU nonpartisan issue-based electoral work in places right now like Montana, because the result of that gubernatorial will decide whether lots of anti-repro legislation moves into law in a state like Montana. And so you realize sort of in a crucial way that the outcome of that gubernatorial will affect access to abortion in a state like Montana. We are similarly doing state legislative work in Arizona with the same baseline calculus, depending on the results, depending on the decision that voters make between now and November 3rd. You might have a bit of a firewall at the state level to protect access to abortion, or you might not. And given what we all generally assume about how the court might change its posture on these issues, the stakes end up being really, really high. And then the last thing I'll note is the other sort of obvious, crucial implication is that our work in and around the presidential election, it was already quite important. You didn't actually need to level up at all, but it becomes, even more important because you can imagine a sort of Donald Trump's second term with even, less of a check at the Supreme Court level, heading down the path to pretty, horrendous abuses pretty quickly. And so all of that focuses the mind. To Ria's question on the nomination specifically, I'll note that you may have noticed that we came out as an institution with a statement on the nomination process. As an institution, we don't endorse or oppose particular nominees, but we felt it important to make a strong statement in opposition to the process that is developed around this nomination. And as you may have seen, we grounded that opposition in sort of two planks. First, the reversal of what you might call the Merrick-Garland rule. In 2016, the current majority leader in the Senate said that in an election year, nominations should not move forward and the people should get a chance to decide via the election. Now that we're in 2020 with the exact same Senate majority leader, that rule has somehow disappeared from a sort of rule of law, norms-based consistency perspective. That feels wrong to us, and so we expressed that view. The second plank was simply, you know, as Ria noted at the top, we are 34 days away from the election, and there is simply no time to have the Senate really carry out a serious job of advice and consent, their constitutional obligation in a situation like this, and we also objected there. I mean, the Senate was expected to be in recess from October 12th through the election because there was other stuff to do, like campaign for office. That has obviously been a plan that has changed, and it sort of just highlights how sort of haphazard and rushed and sort of non-seriously this process has been taken, and so we objected there too. So we issued that statement, and since then, we have tried to calibrate a series of actions that might have an effect. I think most people assume that the outcome here is inevitable, but we are nevertheless, you know, in that fight, and our members and volunteers are also in that fight. So we issued an all call to members and supporters, encouraging them to reach out to their senators, asking for a delay on this process until after inauguration. We've also done and will continue to do some outreach to, you know, what you might call the Senate's institutionalists, the Chuck Grassley's of the world, that you might be able to reach with the sort of baseline argument that if the Senate moves forward with this very sort of naked partisan power grab, it will inevitably trigger a series of actions and reactions from the other party when they happen to get in power that will change the way the Senate functions in a way that, again, is probably not good for our democratic system. And so we will do that work. Again, the odds are pretty long here, but we will fight this one because, you know, it's what we owe RBG. And so I'll stop there, but happy to talk more about that work later on.
Thank you for that, Ronnie. And I know we'll have a chance to talk a bit more about RBG and what she meant to us in the breakout sessions. But I want to use our remaining time together in this broader group really to just drill down on protecting the right to vote. Sophia, you shared a bit with us about the census litigation, which of course, even before COVID-19 was an attack on the right to vote. But so share with us, how many cases have you filed just since the pandemic began?
So since the first case filed, I think in early April, actually in Texas, we are, along with the affiliates, we have filed 25 lawsuits just related to COVID-19 and making sure that voters have access to safe options, and that those options are truly safe for those voters and that they are not disenfranchised on the flip side of it after the ballots are cast. We are making our way through them, trying to get these rules set as soon as possible, which is why we've had 4 trials this month, because, you know, it does make sense to try to get these rules set so that everyone knows what the rules are. But I will say, you know, in a typical election year with a high profile race, we probably have maybe 5 or 6 lawsuits of this sort that is really geared towards making sure that the rules of that election are fair and that everyone's treated equally in that process. But 25 is a lot, and just kind of tells you sort of the pace of litigation right now among us, among other groups as well, including, for example, a lot of defensive work that we're doing in places like Pennsylvania, where the Trump campaign is actually suing the state to try to roll back some very common sense reforms, for example, using drop boxes so that voters don't have to worry about USPS to get their mail ballots in on time back to the elections office. So these common sense solutions that states are thinking to do on their own are even being challenged in particular places that are probably going to have an outsized impact on the election. So most of these lawsuits that we have filed have been about voting by mail in some fashion, either making it actually accessible or getting rid of some of the requirements, like a witness requirement or a notary requirement, so that voters who are trying to stay safe and keep themselves out from going out in the world and violating social distancing norms don't actually have to do that and defeat the purpose of voting by mail in the first instance. On the flip side, fighting back against sort of the technical defects resulting in people's ballots being thrown out. So a lot of voters this year are going to be first-time mail voters. They're not going to be the mail voters that you see time in, time out. So unfortunately, the mail-in ballot process usually has more steps to it. You have to sign your name in a certain place. You have to put your date of birth somewhere, or today's date, or whatever it might be. And there's a lot more room for small issues. So bringing lawsuits to ensure that voters at the very least have notice that something may be wrong with their ballot and an opportunity to fix that problem so their ballot is counted. So that's been sort of the general focus of the litigation, specifically around COVID, although, as I mentioned earlier, we do have existing litigation about access to the ballot across a number of different things. One thing I did want to highlight is one of the reasons I think that we've been able to move so quickly in so many places is because of the fact that we have this very strong affiliate structure and have been partnering with our affiliates on the ground to bring these cases as quickly as possible and to use the litigation as a tool to push sort of a simultaneous advocacy effort using supporters, using members, using all the tools that we have, so that a number of the wins that we have, while maybe started with a lawsuit, actually may have resulted in many of these cases either with a consent decree, which is still court ordered, but in agreement with the state who says, okay, fine, this does make us look really stupid. But also midway through a case, legislation that is adopted in response to our lawsuit. And we've actually had legislators on the floor of their state houses say, the ACLU brought this lawsuit, we need to get it fixed because we don't want the courts to tell us what to do. So, it's just a good example of, the multi-pronged advocacy approach that we have to fighting some of these issues on a state-by-state basis and how we can get successes despite what feels potentially like a difficult court regime to be in, for example, to be litigating in.
So I want to make sure we have time to hear again from Ronnie before we hit the halfway mark. But I just want to say I think Sophia is being a bit modest about how hard the voting rights team is working. I mean, when she says 4 trials in a year, you see trials on TV that may not seem like a lot. That is not what it's like to be a civil rights lawyer. I mean, we can easily go an entire year with 0 trials. And so for this one team within the legal department to have 4 trials during the pandemic, I know one of our lawyers was doing 2 trials in 2 states at the same time via Zoom. She was literally, she was magically in 2 places at once. I mean, this is just a tremendous, tremendous effort. I don't know how Sophia sleeps, and she's too modest to say that. So I just have to let you all know what extraordinary work is happening in the Voting Rights Project. It is truly heroic. Ronnie, we have just a few minutes before we hit the 3:30 mark. So I just want to give you a chance to walk us through, how we're making sure that those voters actually do turn out, and particularly given the pandemic, when our usual tools of, knocking on doors and getting out there in the streets aren't available in the same way. How are we pivoting? How are we doing this in 2020?
Love that. You know, this is obviously a really important election. You know, perhaps the most important election we've ever faced. And a big part of how we're responding to that institutionally is trying to make sure that as many people participate in that election as possible. And Sophia has talked about how our sort of litigation work is opening up doors and easing barriers to the franchise. We are also aiding in that effort on the political front. And I think you can sort of safely assume that we and our affiliates are doing work in this lane in each and every state in the country. But there are a few places where our level of engagement is of a higher order, where we are sort of engaged in a sort of type of program that is uniquely labor intensive and resource intensive. And I do want to share a little bit about how that is developing. The sort of two most notable places are Michigan and Wisconsin. Michigan is a place that's sort of near and dear to us because we brought a ballot measure, a ballot initiative in 2018 that changed the voting rights system in Michigan and allowed things for the first time, like no excuse absentee voting, automatic voter registration, same day registration. Before 2018, those did not exist in Michigan. We did that work principally to make it easier for everybody to vote, but particularly communities of color and young folks. And so as we entered into this really important year, we said we should double down and fully close the loop on that work by doing everything we can conceivably do to get those folks to the polls. And so we have launched a program in Michigan that is communicating principally with African-American voters and voters under 35 in every imaginable way in the time of a pandemic. So they are receiving mail pieces from us, some that explain the mechanics of how to vote in this unique situation, where they can go and vote early, the specific location of their county clerk's office, the hours of operation, essentially making the act easier. Some that lay out some of the issues at stake in this particular election. What happens on abortion? What happens on criminal justice reform? What happens on immigrants' rights as a result of this election? Essentially issue motivation content that might encourage them to get off the sofa and vote, or go to the kitchen table and, you know, fill out the mail ballot. And so we're communicating with people through mail and through digital, through radio. We will likely do some lower scale TV work. This is also a place where the people power system that we've developed with our volunteers comes into play, because we are able to call voters and text voters with this same type of information. So it's a twofold, layered, multi-pronged sort of effort to ensure that people are as motivated as possible to vote, and also know exactly how to do it in the way that is easiest, most convenient, and safe, you know, most safe for them specifically. And so that work is full speed ahead in Michigan. We have a fairly similar program like that in Wisconsin, and feel confident that through those efforts, turnout for some of these key demographic groups will be up this year, as well as turnout as a percentage of the overall electorate. And so we're really proud of that work, and you know, we'll see over the next 34 days how much impact we can have.
Thanks, Ronnie. I know there's a lot more we could say about that, but I think it's time to turn it over to Makiba to lead us into our breakout room.